I'll tell you this like I'd tell it to someone sitting across from me, late at night, when the room's quiet and the lights are low. No drama, no build-up. Just the way it happened, or at least the way I remember it. When I was a kid, I used to watch football with my Uncle Ray, not my dad. My dad was around, just not really there, if that makes sense. Ray was the one who showed up. He'd pick me up on Sundays, buy terrible gas station snacks, and explain the rules even though I barely listened. Mostly, I just liked sitting next to him. Liked the way he yelled at the TV like the players could hear him. Ray died when I was 16. Heart attack, no warning. One week he was calling me to argue about a referee. The next week he was gone. After that, I stopped watching football completely. Every time a game came on, it felt wrong, like I'd wandered into a room I wasn't supposed to be in anymore. I didn't come back to it until years later, in 2021. I was 30 by then. I'd moved to a small city called Brookhaven Ridge, the kind of place with one main road and too many chain restaurants. I'd started hanging out with a coworker named Eli. We weren't close at first, just friendly. But his sister, Mara, hosted these casual Sunday get-togethers at her house, and football was always on in the background. Somehow, without me noticing when it happened, football crept back into my life. It wasn't about the game. It was about the routine. Sitting on a couch, plates stacked with food, someone always half listening, half talking. It reminded me of Ray in a way that didn't hurt as much as I expected. That's why, when Eli surprised me with tickets to a pro game for my birthday, I said yes without thinking. The stadium was in a city called Ironvale, almost 4 hours away. Mara and Eli planned to drive back the same night. I didn't want to. Something about being exhausted on the highway at midnight didn't sit right with me, so I booked a small rental house just outside the city. Not fancy, just a one-story place with beige siding and a gravel driveway. The game itself was loud and wild and kind of overwhelming. Toward the end, when everything was tense and everyone was standing, someone behind me shoved forward and knocked my drink out of my hand. Beer splashed down the back of the guy in front of me. I apologized right away, like really apologized. Hands up, voice calm. But he turned around slowly and stared at me like I'd done something on purpose. He didn't yell at first. He talked quietly, but every word felt sharp. He leaned in close enough that I could smell his breath and told me to watch myself. Then he smiled in a way that didn't match his eyes and turned back around. I tried to forget about it once the game ended and everyone started cheering. We won. The crowd poured out into the night. Eli and Mara left, waving as they disappeared into traffic. I drove to the rental house alone. The place felt fine at first. Quiet, clean, a little too quiet, maybe, but I told myself that was just city noise dropping away. I ordered food, ate too much, and scrolled on my phone until my eyes burned. Eventually, I fell asleep on the bed fully dressed. Something woke me up later. Not a bang, more like a soft tapping. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It sounded like small stones hitting the side of the house. I waited, holding my breath like that would somehow help me hear better. The sound came again, same place, same rhythm. My skin felt tight, like I was bracing for something without knowing what. I turned on the lamp, then another light. The house looked normal, but normal didn't feel reassuring anymore. I walked to the window and pressed my face close to the glass. Outside was just darkness and trees swaying gently. I told myself I was being stupid. Told myself it was an animal, wind, anything. I stepped outside anyway. The air was cold and smelled like wet leaves. I walked along the side of the house, crunching over gravel. Near the wall, I saw a few small rocks gathered together, like they'd been placed there. That bothered me more than if they'd been scattered. I stood there for a minute, listening. Nothing happened. I turned back toward the door, and that's when I noticed the lights inside. They were on. All of them. I knew I hadn't turned every light on. I stopped moving. From where I stood, I could see straight through the kitchen window. Someone walked past it, slow, unhurried, wearing a dark hoodie. I don't remember crouching, but suddenly I was low to the ground, pressed against a tree. My hands shook so badly, I almost dropped my phone dialing for help. I whispered to the dispatcher while watching the person move through the house. They opened cabinets, closets, doors, like they knew exactly what they were looking for. They went through my bag, pulled out my wallet, looked at it for a long time. They didn't take it. That's what scared me the most. After a while, they started moving faster, slamming doors, checking the same places again. When the sound of sirens reached the house, they didn't panic. They climbed out a window and vanished into the trees. The police came. They searched. They asked questions. They told me I was lucky. No one was ever caught. Later, when I told Eli everything, he asked me something that made my stomach turn. He asked what the guy at the game looked like. When I described him, Eli went quiet, said it sounded familiar, said he'd seen someone like that around Ironvale before. I don't know if it was the same person. I don't know if anyone followed me. I don't even know what that person was looking for in the house. But sometimes, when I think about it late at night, I remember how carefully they looked at my wallet, how they didn't take a single thing, and I wonder if they already had what they came for. I used to rent a small attic flat on Hawthorne Rise, back when I was 27. This was in 2014, the year everything felt a bit off anyway. The street sat on the edge of an old neighborhood in a city called Breckmere, the kind of place where the houses were too big for modern life and had been awkwardly chopped into rentals. My younger cousin Eli lived with me at the time. He'd just moved to the city after a rough breakup and needed somewhere cheap to land. We weren't especially close growing up, but living together had a way of smoothing things out. He worked nights at a warehouse. I worked early mornings at a printing office across town. We mostly passed each other like ghosts, trading nods in the hallway, sharing groceries without really talking about it. If I needed food, I walked downhill to a place called Greenwell Market. It wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk, but the route always felt longer. Hawthorne Rise curved gently downward, lined with tall, narrow houses that leaned toward the street like they were listening. Most of them had once been private homes, probably owned by people with money and patience. By the time I lived there, they'd been split into flats with mismatched doorbells and peeling paint. A few of the buildings hadn't become apartments. One was a dance school. Another had frosted windows and no sign at all. I assumed it was a dentist or some kind of office and never gave it much thought. I'm not the kind of person who goes looking for strange things. I keep my head down, earbuds in, get where I'm going. That's why the first thing didn't register as anything more than odd. One morning, just after 6, I was halfway down Hawthorne Rise with a lukewarm coffee and a comedy podcast playing quietly in my ears. The sky was that flat gray that makes everything look unfinished. I noticed a man standing ahead of me on the pavement. He wasn't pacing or checking his phone. He was just standing there, hands folded, staring at the building with the frosted windows. I barely looked at him. People stand around for all kinds of reasons. As I passed him, he said something. I didn't hear it clearly, just a low murmur that didn't fit the rhythm of the street. It sounded deliberate, like he'd waited for me. I stopped, slid one earbud out, and asked, "Sorry, what?" He turned his head slowly and looked straight at me. His eyes were pale, almost watery, like they didn't quite belong in his face. He didn't answer my question. He just kept talking, his voice calm and steady. "They don't stop screaming," he said, "even when the fire goes out. More come every day." He said it the way someone might comment on the weather. My brain took a second to catch up. I nodded, smiled tightly, and said, "Right, okay." Then I walked away without looking back. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel threatened. I just felt uncomfortable, like I'd brushed past something I didn't want to name. By the time I reached work, the moment had dulled. Printers jammed, phones rang. Life filled the space where the thought might have lingered. I didn't see the man again for weeks. Then one morning he was back, same spot, same posture. This time he wasn't alone. Two older women stood beside him. They were close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Each held a small book, warm at the edges. Their lips moved as they read, voices so soft they blended with the hum of the street. I crossed the road to avoid squeezing past them. As I did, the man looked up. Our eyes met. He smiled, slow and knowing, like we shared a secret I couldn't remember agreeing to keep. I told Eli about it that evening while we ate dinner on the couch. He laughed and said Hawthorne Rise had always attracted weirdos. He worked nights, so he'd never seen them. It wasn't until days later that I realized where they'd been standing. The building with the frosted windows wasn't an office. I looked it up out of idle curiosity. The website was gentle, lots of soft colors, carefully chosen words. It took a bit of clicking, but the meaning settled in eventually. It was a women's health clinic. After that, I started noticing more things. The man was there most mornings, sometimes with the women, sometimes alone, sometimes talking quietly to himself. Once, as I passed, I heard him humming. The tune stuck with me all day, even though I couldn't place it. I began leaving the flat earlier, just to avoid him. That didn't always help. One morning, I heard him before I saw him. His voice drifted down the street, low and steady. "They stack them so high now," he said, not looking at me. "You can smell it if the wind's right." I didn't stop. I didn't respond. I walked faster, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the pavement. That afternoon, Eli texted me from work. Did someone die in the building across the street? I stared at my phone for a long time before replying. "What do you mean?" He said he'd seen emergency lights outside the clinic just before sunrise. No sirens, just flashing blue reflecting off the windows. A few days later, the man was gone. The women still came sometimes. They stood farther back now, across the street, heads bowed. They didn't whisper anymore. They just watched. I started sleeping badly. I'd wake up smelling smoke, even though nothing was burning. Once, I thought I heard someone crying in the stairwell, thin and distant, like it was coming from inside the walls. Eli moved out not long after. He said the place made him uneasy. I didn't argue. The last morning I walked down Hawthorne Rise, the pavement was empty. The clinic's windows looked darker than usual. As I passed, I heard something faint behind me. A voice, low and familiar. Still burning. I didn't turn around. I still don't know if it was him, or if it ever was. Sometimes I wonder if the street just learned how to talk, and I happened to listen. I want to tell you a story the way I'd tell it to a friend late at night, maybe sitting on a couch with the lights low. When the house makes those little noises, you try not to think about. It's one of those stories that didn't feel that scary at the time, but the longer I sit with it, the more it crawls under my skin. This happened in 2016, back when I was 23, and thought I understood people a lot better than I actually did. There's nothing quite like the atmosphere at a college sports game. You don't even have to care about the sport. The noise alone pulls you in. The chanting, the stomping, the way the whole building seems to breathe as one giant animal. It feels safe, almost comforting, like you're part of something bigger for a few hours. That night, I went to a basketball game at Redfield Arena, a concrete monster of a building tucked behind the old Science Hall at Northridge College. I went with my cousin Aaron, who had an extra ticket and didn't want to go alone. We weren't super close, but we got along well enough. He loved sports. I mostly loved the excuse to get out of my apartment. Our seats weren't great, but they weren't terrible either. Middle level. Loud enough to feel the energy, far enough away that no one expected you to scream the whole time. Before the game started, I noticed the guy sitting in front of us. His name, I'd later learn, was Caleb. He turned around at some point and made a joke about the warm-up music being too loud. Normal stuff. He was about my age, maybe a little older, with a thick jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. We ended up talking a bit before tip-off. Nothing deep. Where we were from. Who we thought would win. He mentioned he worked at the same warehouse I did, just a different shift. That surprised me. It felt like a small coincidence, like one of those moments that makes the world feel tighter than it should be. Caleb was cheering for the other team, which was brave in that arena. We laughed about it. He took some light teasing pretty well at first. When the game started, he even reached back and bumped fists with me like it was all in good fun. The game mattered. You could feel it. Late season, playoff implications. Every call from the refs set the crowd off. I got swept up in it, shouting things I wouldn't normally say, feeling bold because everyone around me was shouting too. Somewhere near the end of the first half, Caleb changed. It wasn't dramatic at first, just little things. His shoulders tensed. His comments stopped being jokes and started sounding sharp. He yelled at the refs, then at the players, then just sort of yelled in general. When a call went against his team right before halftime, the arena exploded with cheers. Caleb didn't cheer. He ripped his hat off and slammed it onto the concrete floor so hard it bounced into the row ahead of us. I don't know why I did what I did next. I think I thought I was calming things down. Or maybe I just wanted to feel like part of the crowd. I leaned forward and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Hey, man, second half's still coming." Could turn around. The second my hand touched him, his whole body snapped tight. He twisted around so fast, his knee hit the seat, knocking it up. His face was red, eyes wide, like he'd been startled awake. "Don't touch me," he shouted. Not yelled, shouted. Spit flew from his mouth. The people around us went quiet for a second. I pulled my hand back right away and muttered an apology, but he was still staring at me, breathing hard, like he was memorizing my face. Aaron leaned over and asked if everything was okay. I told him yeah, just some guy taking the game too seriously. At halftime, I went to get a drink just to put some space between me and that stare. In the concourse, with the noise echoing off the walls and people laughing and spilling popcorn everywhere, it felt stupid to be shaken. I even joked about it with Aaron when I came back. Then, as we were standing there, Caleb bumped into me. Hard, shoulder to chest. "Oh, sorry," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Guess I should watch where I'm going." I smelled alcohol on his breath. Strong, sour. I decided then that ignoring him was the smartest thing I could do. The second half dragged. Every time something went wrong for his team, Caleb muttered under his breath, sometimes louder, like he wanted me to hear. I kept my eyes on the court and pretended he didn't exist. When the game finally ended, the home team won. The crowd poured out into the cold night, buzzing and loud. Aaron and I split up in the parking lot since we'd driven separately. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, unhurried. Caleb's voice floated up over the noise. "You think you're funny back there?" I didn't answer. He kept talking. Insults. Accusations that didn't make sense. Saying I disrespected him. Saying people like me always think they're untouchable in a crowd. I kept walking. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. I turned and told him to back off, my voice cracking in a way I hated. He laughed. Not loud, just a short breathy sound, like he'd heard a private joke. I drove home with my heart racing, checking my mirrors the whole way. I lived on Briar Hollow Road, a narrow street with no driveways, just old houses and cars parked along the curb. It was quiet there, too quiet sometimes. That night, I got home, locked the door, and collapsed on the couch. I watched movies until my brain felt numb. Somewhere past 2 a.m, I noticed headlights flashing across my living room wall. Once, twice. The third time, I stood up and looked out the window. Someone was standing by my car. They were leaning in, pressing their face close to the glass, cupping their hands around their eyes to see inside. The car rocked slightly as they tugged on the door handle. My chest went cold. The streetlight flickered, and for just a second, I saw his face. Caleb. I called the police with shaking fingers. I whispered, like he could hear me through the walls. While I was on the phone, he moved across the street and started trying the door of the house there, slamming his shoulder into it again and again. I told the dispatcher he had the wrong house. I told her he wasn't supposed to be there. That's when I noticed something dark tucked into the back of his waistband. I couldn't tell what it was. I still can't, but I knew it wasn't nothing. The police lights arrived fast, red and blue washing over everything. Caleb didn't fight. He just stood there, swaying, staring straight at my house while they cuffed him. The next day, they told me he claimed he didn't remember anything. The game, the parking lot, my street. They said he'd sobered up confused and embarrassed. Here's the part that still keeps me awake. A week later, I found muddy footprints leading up to my front window. Fresh ones. Too big to be mine. No one ever knocked. No one ever tried the door. But sometimes, when a car slows down outside late at night, I swear I hear someone laugh. Just once. Soft, like they're standing very still, deciding whether this time they'll remember what they came for. I used to make my living playing music. Not anything fancy. Just guitar, a tired voice, and bars that smelled like beer, no matter how early you got there. I'd been doing it since the late 1990s, bouncing around little towns most people only pass through on the way to somewhere else. By 2018, I'd logged more miles than I could remember, and most of them blurred together. Music was my excuse to be out there, but talking to people was the real draw. After a show, I liked to sit at the bar and listen. Folks open up after a few drinks. They tell you things they don't tell their families. Sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it's sad. And sometimes it sticks with you in a way that makes your stomach feel tight years later. This happened in a town called Redfield Ridge, tucked into the flatter part of the northern plains. I don't even remember what state it was in now. Cold place, windy. The kind of town where the buildings are low and spread out, like they're afraid to stand too tall. We played at a bar called the Bent Nail. Long room, sticky floor, neon beer signs humming like insects. After the set, my cousin Mark, who was driving the van for me that year, headed back early. He'd always been like that. Smart, didn't drink much. Said he'd rather sleep than talk. I stayed behind, nursing a beer, enjoying the quiet that comes after music stops. That's when an older man sat down beside me. He smelled faintly of motor oil and peppermint. He had thin gray hair, combed neat, and hands that shook just a little when he lifted his glass. He told me my playing reminded him of his brother. I told him thanks, even though I didn't know what that meant. We talked about nothing at first. Weather, roads, how loud the wind gets at night. Then he asked if traveling ever scared me. I laughed and said sometimes, yeah. He nodded like that was the right answer. His name, he said, was Walter. He lived just outside town in a big old farmhouse that used to be full of people. Wife, kids, grandkids once for a while. Now it was just him. He said it like he was talking about an empty shed. He told me crime had gotten worse in the last few years. Break-ins, tools disappearing, copper pulled from walls, people high on things he didn't want to name. He said they weren't thieves so much as animals, and then quickly apologized for saying it that way. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. Walter told me someone had tried his place once. Then again after that. He said he stopped sleeping in his bed and started sleeping in a chair by the window. He laughed softly when he said that, like it was a harmless habit. Then his voice dropped. He told me about the night headlights rolled up his long gravel drive, about the crunch of boots on stone, about how he fired a warning shot into the dark, hands shaking so bad he thought he'd missed the sky. They fired back. He said he still heard those shots sometimes, even when everything was quiet, especially when everything was quiet. The sheriff, he told me, said there wasn't much to be done. Not enough deputies, too many calls. Walter said the sheriff asked him something that stuck. What are you really protecting? Walter decided to leave town for a bit. At least, that's what he told people. He rented a big moving truck, the kind with thick metal doors and heavy locks. He parked it right behind his house, like he was halfway gone. A few days later, he came back. That's when he found the bullet holes. He told me how the truck looked from the outside, pocked and torn like it had been chewed on. Inside, it was worse. He said the smell hit him first. Thick, wet, wrong. He said it clung to the back of his throat. 3 bodies were inside. The official story was simple. They locked themselves in, got desperate. Things went bad. Drugs were involved. Case closed. Walter stared into his empty glass when he told me this part, and he looked at me and smiled. Not wide, just enough. He said the lock didn't break. He said he fixed it that way. He told me how he tested it, how he made sure once those doors shut, there was no way out. He talked about stacking old boxes inside, TVS, radios, anything that looked valuable. He said temptation does half the work for you. The men came back just like they promised, angry, armed, but curiosity beat revenge. It always does? Walter said he listened to them for a long time after the door slammed. Listened to the shouting, the pounding, the gunshots echoing uselessly inside metal walls. He said the sounds changed after the first day, became weaker, slower. He told me he never went far, just sat inside his house, lights off, listening. He said after a while, they stopped yelling at him and started yelling at each other. When he finished the story, he laughed. It wasn't loud, just a breathy sound that didn't quite fit the room. I remember realizing the bar was empty. Chairs up, lights dim. I hadn't noticed anyone leave. Walter stood up, patted my shoulder, and said it was nice talking to me. He told me to be careful on the road. Said you never really know who's watching. I didn't sleep much that night. Or the next. Years later, I still think about that story. About the way he told it. About how calm he was. Sometimes I wonder if he told it the same way to other people, or if it was just me. And sometimes, when I'm alone and everything is quiet, I think I hear something like fists hitting metal, far away, slow and tired, like they've been doing it for a very long time. I don't know if that's memory, or if some things don't stay where they're supposed to. I was 21 in 2013 when my older cousin Mark decided to start over. Mark wasn't just my cousin. He was more like the big brother I never had. He'd been around my whole life, the kind of guy who always landed on his feet. If something went wrong, he shrugged it off and figured something else out. So when he told us he was moving across the country for a woman he met online, we teased him, but none of us were really worried. Back then, meeting someone online still felt a bit sketchy. Dating apps weren't what they are now. You didn't casually swipe while waiting for coffee. You met someone online and people raised their eyebrows. We joked that the woman, Anna, was probably fake, or secretly married, or 80 years old. Mark laughed it off. She wasn't fake. A few months later, we met her. She was real, warm, and clearly smitten with him, and he was head over heels. Less than a year later, Mark packed up his things and moved from our quiet hometown near Lakewood Ridge all the way down to a coastal city called Seabrook Falls. It was far, too far for weekend visits. And Mark didn't have a car. He promised he'd visit. He always did. But once he moved, we barely heard from him. At first, everything sounded fine. He found work washing dishes at a seafood place near the pier. Hannah still lived with her aunt, so Mark rented a room in a shared apartment on the edge of town. He said his roommate was a bit odd, but harmless. That's all he ever said about him. Whenever I asked questions, Mark changed the subject. He talked about the ocean, the fog, the job, how tired he was all the time. He sounded thinner, somehow, like he was talking through clenched teeth. About 2 months later, he invited me and my friend Caleb to visit for a weekend. Said we could crash on the couch. We drove down on a Friday afternoon, following winding roads that hugged the cliffs. The closer we got to Seabrook Falls, the darker it felt. The fog didn't lift, even in daylight. It clung to the road like breath on glass. Mark met us outside his apartment building. I remember noticing how different he looked before he even spoke. His face was pale. His eyes were sunken. He hugged us, but it felt stiff, like he was distracted. Inside, the place smelled wrong. Sour, like old beer and damp clothes. The carpet was sticky under our shoes. Dirty plates were stacked in the sink, crusted with food that had been there way too long. Mark made tea. His hands shook. I finally asked if he was okay. He didn't answer right away. He sat down, stared at the wall, and said, "I messed up." That's when he told us about his roommate, Neil. Neil had seemed normal at first. Friendly, talkative, always offering drinks, always home. Too much home. Mark said Neil didn't really work. He found money. At first, Mark didn't ask how. Then he found out. Neil stole stores, cars, drunk tourists. Whatever he could, he drank from morning to night. When he wasn't drinking, he was on something else. Pills, powder, things Mark didn't recognize. Things that made Neil's eyes look flat and shiny, like glass beads. Neil never cleaned, never paid rent. The landlord avoided the place entirely. Mark realized later the apartment had been cleaned just before he moved in, like a trap being reset. The worst part wasn't the mess or the noise. It was Neil's moods. Mark said sometimes Neil would stand in the hallway at night, just breathing, not moving, not speaking. Other nights, he screamed at nothing, kicked walls, threw furniture. Once, Mark came home and found Neil in his room, swinging a long hunting knife slowly through the air, like he was practicing on something invisible. Mark locked his door every night after that. Once Neil tried to climb into his bed. Mark's voice cracked when he said that. He told us he'd tried to leave, just mentioned it casually. Neil snapped, got in his face, smiled while he threatened him. Said if Mark wanted out, he'd have to earn it. That was why we were there. We were supposed to help Mark leave on Sunday afternoon, when Neil usually disappeared for hours. We'd move his stuff to Hannah's aunt's garage. Quietly, quickly. We hadn't met Neil yet. Then we heard the door open. Keys rattled. Heavy footsteps. Mark went silent. He looked smaller somehow, like he was folding into himself. Neil walked in. He didn't look how I expected. He was tall, thin, covered in faded tattoos. His hair hung in greasy strands around his face. His smile was wide and slow, like it took effort. He stared at us too long. Then he laughed and said, "Guests?" He insisted we stay, insisted on a party. Said it'd be rude not to celebrate. Mark nodded along, eyes down. Later, outside, Mark told us it was better this way. If Neil spent his money tonight, he'd be gone tomorrow. That night felt endless. Neil drank constantly. His girlfriend showed up, quiet and twitchy, barely meeting anyone's eyes. The music was loud enough to make my teeth buzz. Neil got mean as the night went on, mocking, pushing boundaries, daring Mark to drink more, to use more. Mark did, every time. Then Neil started dancing with his girlfriend. At first, it was awkward. Then it got rough. He wrapped his arm around her neck, held it there too long. She struggled. He laughed. When she finally fought back, everything exploded. Neil hit her. Mark moved without thinking. We all did. We tackled Neil to the floor as he screamed and thrashed, spitting threats. I called the police while he promised he'd remember our faces. Promised he'd find us. The police took him away after he tried to bite one of them. We had one day. We moved Mark out fast. No talking. No goodbyes. He left his mattress, his books, things he loved. We didn't care. On Sunday night, we celebrated. Quietly. Mark smiled for the first time all weekend. But here's the thing. A week later, Mark stopped answering calls. Hannah said he'd been tired, sleeping a lot, hearing things at night, knocking sounds, breathing outside the garage. A month later, she said he'd moved out on his own again. Didn't say where. Last I heard, someone new had moved into that old apartment in Seabrook Falls. They described the place as freshly cleaned. And sometimes, late at night, neighbors say they hear slow footsteps in the hallway, just pacing, waiting. I've always been one of those people who can't sit still for long. Ever since I was a kid, I needed motion. Running, lifting, hitting, sweating. If I wasn't moving, my brain felt like it was buzzing. Back in school, everyone thought I'd go somewhere big with it. Sports came easy to me. Coaches loved me. Crowds cheered my name. For a while, I thought that noise would last forever. It didn't. I didn't end up famous. I didn't end up rich. Life softened me down into something quieter. I got older. I settled into a normal job. These days, my biggest responsibility isn't winning games. It's taking care of my niece, Rowan. Rowan isn't my kid. She's my sister's. Long story there. She lives with me now and has for a few years. She's smart, curious, and way too trusting for her own good. She asks questions about everything. Why ceilings creak? Why people stare? Why some smiles feel fake? You know the type of kid who notices things adults pretend not to see. This happened in 2016. I got an invitation in the mail from Northbrook College, the place where I used to play. They'd just finished building a brand new athletic complex. Glass walls, shiny floors, donor plaques everywhere. They were hosting an alumni night. Tour, dinner, speeches, the usual backpatting stuff. I wasn't going to go. I tossed the invite on the counter and forgot about it. But Rowan found it later and got excited. She'd never seen a college campus before. She asked if there would be mascots, if athletes lived there, if she could run on the field. I figured, why not? One night, make a memory. We'd go, grab some food, walk around, then leave early. The campus looked different when we arrived. Too clean, too polished, like it had been scrubbed of anything human. The new building glowed against the dark, all bright lights and wide windows. From the outside, it felt less like a school and more like a museum. Inside, everything echoed. Our footsteps sounded too loud. Laughter bounced off the walls and came back thinner, distorted. People wore nice clothes and plastic smiles. I recognized a few old faces, but most of them were strangers with name tags and forced charm. Rowan stayed close to me, holding onto my sleeve. At first, that didn't last. She loved the tour, loved the giant weight room with mirrors that made her look like she went on forever, loved the locker rooms that smelled like soap and metal. She posed with the school mascot, laughing while its oversized head tilted at a strange angle, like it was watching her too closely. Someone handed her a little spinning toy with the school logo on it. She twirled it nonstop, mesmerized by the blur. I noticed a man watching us, not in an obvious way. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He stood near the edges of rooms, pretending to look at plaques or phones. But every time I glanced over, his eyes were already on Rowan. When I met his stare, he looked away too quickly, like a kid caught doing something wrong. I told myself I was being paranoid. Eventually, a woman from the administration pulled me aside. She remembered me from my playing days, wanted to introduce me to someone important. I hesitated, then agreed. Rowan stood next to me, spinning her toy, humming to herself. I was only turned away for a minute, maybe less. Someone laughed. Hands shook, words blurred together. When I looked back down, Rowan wasn't there. That moment still plays in my head in slow motion. The air felt thick. Sounds dropped away. I remember thinking, she's right here. She has to be. She wasn't. I scanned under the table, around the chairs. Nothing. Then I saw her. She was walking down the main hallway toward a darker section of the building that hadn't been opened yet. Her small hand was wrapped around the fingers of an adult man. It was him, the Watcher. I shouted her name so loud my throat burned. People turned. Someone dropped a glass. I pushed through bodies, knocking into shoulders, not caring who I upset. He didn't look back. Rowan did. She smiled and waved, like this was all part of some game. I reached them and yanked her into my arms. She laughed, confused, asking why I looked scared. The man finally faced me. Up close, his smile was wrong. Too calm, too sure. His eyes didn't blink enough. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. He said he thought she was lost. He said she reminded him of someone. He said I didn't need to make a scene. I don't remember exactly what I yelled. I know my hands were shaking. I know I told someone to call the police. I know people started whispering. Someone pulled the man away, talking to him quietly, like they were trying not to embarrass him. I heard words like benefactor and misunderstanding. By the time security arrived, he was gone. We left immediately. I didn't want Rowan anywhere near that place anymore. We drove to a diner a few miles away and shared ice cream at a cracked vinyl booth. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong, that sometimes grown-ups make bad choices. She nodded, listening carefully. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. She told me the man knew her name. I never told the police that part. Nothing came of the incident. No follow-up. No calls. No reports. It was like the whole thing dissolved once we left town. Years have passed since then. Rowan is older now. Quieter. She doesn't spin toys anymore. She still asks questions, but they're different. Darker. Sometimes, when she thinks I'm not looking, she stares out windows at night. Sometimes she asks if I remember that building. The one with all the glass. Last week, she asked me something new. She asked why I grabbed her that night. She said the man had told her he'd been waiting a long time. I asked her what else he said. She shrugged. Sighed she couldn't remember. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her whispering in her room. Not talking, practicing, repeating her name. Like she's making sure she still owns it. I moved so many times growing up that I stopped unpacking properly. I'd leave books in boxes because, honestly, what was the point? You learn to live out of a backpack. You learn to make friends fast and lose them faster. You learn the feeling of a new start isn't hopeful. It's just exhausting. By the time this happened, it was 1999, and I was 19. Not a kid, not really, but still young enough that adults talked to me like I was harmless. Like I didn't know how the world worked. My older sister, Marin, and I had just landed in Eagle Harbor, Michigan, a small town that sat by cold water and big trees. We'd come to live with our Aunt Lisa after Marin's breakup and my latest failed semester. Lisa had a spare room, a big laugh, and that calm Midwestern way of saying, "You'll figure it out," as if figuring it out was as simple as finding the right light switch. Eagle Harbor was pretty. I'll give it that. Pines everywhere. Fog that rolled in off the lake like someone was exhaling through the whole town. But I hated it at first. Not because it was ugly. Because it was quiet in a way that makes you hear yourself think. And because of one man. A few days after we arrived, I took my bike out just to burn off nerves. I rode up and down our street, past houses with porches and old grills and wind chimes that never seemed to stop. That's when I saw a guy about my age walking along the shoulder with a plastic grocery bag swinging from his hand. The bag looked heavy. Not groceries heavy. Wet heavy. Something inside bumped the side of the plastic with a soft slap. I slowed and called out, "Hey, what's in the bag?" He stopped like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. He smiled and held the bag up like a prize. "Dinner," he said. He opened it. Fish. A bunch of them. Not cleaned, not wrapped, just piled together, slick and shiny. Their scales caught the gray daylight like loose change. One of them jerked hard enough that the bag crackled. I just stared. I'd seen fish in a store. Neat little fillets on ice. This was different. This was proof of something alive becoming something not. Where'd you get those? I asked. He jerked his chin toward the trees. Back pond. You? Just caught them? Yeah. He shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. You knew? That's how I met Cade. Cade lived 3 houses down from my aunt. He had messy hair and a sun-faded hoodie that smelled faintly like smoke, the kind you get from a campfire that's been put out with dirt. He talked with his hands. He laughed with his whole face. He made Eagle Harbor feel less like a waiting room. I told him I'd never really fished. He looked honestly surprised, like I'd told him I'd never heard of rain. You want to learn? He asked. Sure, I said, and meant it. 2 days later, Cade showed up with 2 rods. They weren't store-bought. One was a straight branch with line wrapped around it. The other had a reel that looked like it had been pulled off something else and bolted on with stubbornness. Don't judge, he said, grinning. This one's my fancy model. We walked out past the last row of houses and into a narrow trail that dipped through the pines. The air smelled like sap and wet needles. The farther we got from town, the more everything sounded muffled, like the woods were swallowing noise to keep it for themselves. After maybe 20 minutes, the trees opened up, and there it was, a pond like a dark coin dropped into the ground. The surface wasn't still. It moved in slow, oily ripples, even though there was no wind. This is it, Cade said. Back pond. It didn't look like much. Muddy banks, reeds, a few broken bottles stuck in the dirt like they'd been planted. But Cade moved like this place belonged to him, like it had known his feet for years. He picked a spot and handed me the stick rod. Just toss it out and be patient, he said. I did. The line hissed through the guides. The hook plopped into the water. We sat there for a long time, saying almost nothing. It was comfortable in that new friend way, where silence isn't awkward yet. Every so often a frog would croak like it was annoyed. Somewhere farther off, a bird made a sharp, repeating call that sounded too much like laughter. When I caught my first fish, it was small and angry, flicking its tail so hard it sprayed my hands. Cade whooped like I'd won a championship. See? He said, you're a natural. That summer, we went out there whenever we could. Some days we caught enough to actually cook. Other days we sat for hours and got nothing but mosquito bites and stiff backs. Either way, I started to feel steady, like I had one thing in my life that didn't move. That's when we found the second pond. Cade told me about it like he was letting me in on a secret. It's farther, he said one afternoon, but it's better. Bigger water. Bigger fish. I didn't question him. I just followed. The trail to the second pond was rougher. Less of a path, more of an idea. Branches scraped my arms. The ground stayed wet even when it hadn't rained. And once we got close, the air changed. It got colder, like we'd stepped into a shadow that didn't match the sun. The pond itself was huge compared to Back Pond. Wide, dark, and ringed with cattails that stood like a crowd. The water was so black, it reflected the trees perfectly, which made it feel less like a pond and more like a hole. This is the spot, Cade said, quieter than usual. We'd barely set down our stuff when someone shouted from behind us. Hey! We spun around. A man stood on the bank with his fists jammed into his shorts pockets. He was maybe in his late 50s. Thick neck, balding crown. The kind of stomach that pushed his shirt out like it wanted to leave first. He wore a black tee and sandals, and his face had that tight, angry look like he'd been waiting for an excuse all day. What are you doing here? He snapped. Cade straightened up. Fishing. This isn't your pond. We're not hurting anything, Cade said. The man stepped closer, and I saw his eyes weren't just angry. They were excited, like he liked this part, like he lived for it. You got permission? He demanded. You got licenses? You got somebody with you who owns this land? It's not posted, Cade shot back. The man jutted his chin toward the trees. Doesn't matter. I can call the sheriff right now. I was already about to suggest we pack up and leave, because I didn't want trouble, when a second voice came from across the water. Is there a reason you're yelling at them? We turned again. A tall man was walking toward us from the far side of the pond, stepping carefully through the cattails. He wore glasses and a neat cardigan, like he'd dressed for a chilly library instead of a muddy shoreline. His hair was combed back, and his face was calm in a way that made the angry guy look even more ridiculous. The angry man puffed up. These boys are trespassing. The cardigan man tilted his head. Are they? They don't have permission, the angry man insisted. The cardigan man smiled faintly. Well, they have mine. The angry man blinked. This your land? The cardigan man didn't answer right away. He just looked at him like he was deciding what kind of person he was. Then he said softly, "You're welcome to call the sheriff. But you'll have to explain why you're harassing people on public access." The angry man's face went blotchy. He stared like he wanted to argue, but the cardigan man's calm seemed to drain the fight right out of him. He muttered something about kids and stomped away, kicking at reeds as he went. When he was gone, Cade let out a breath like he'd been holding it the whole time. "Thanks," Cade said. "We thought he was gonna make noise," the cardigan man finished, like it was obvious. He held out a hand. "I'm Graham Heller." I shook it. His grip was warm. Too warm for how cold the air was out there. "I'm Rowan," I said. "This is Cade." Graham looked at our rods and smiled. "Homemade?" Cade grinned. "Mostly." "That's resourceful," Graham said, like he genuinely meant it. "I like seeing that." He told us, casually, that his property line was a decent walk back, but that he liked coming out here because of the wildlife. He mentioned herons, fox tracks, and once, like it was nothing, the odd thing you hear after dark. Cade chuckled. I did too, but the laugh didn't feel right in my mouth. Graham said goodbye and continued his walk, hands folded behind his back, cardigan swinging slightly like a curtain. After that, we saw him sometimes. At first, it was just a wave and a quick chat. Then it became a pattern. He'd show up, ask how the fishing was going, and drift away. 20 minutes later, he'd come back with something. Cans of soda, wrapped cookies, little squares of bread that tasted like cinnamon. "My partner bakes too much," he'd say with a small smile, like his life was pleasantly overfull. He'd sit with us sometimes, talking about nothing. Baseball scores, what we did for work, whether we liked living in Eagle Harbor. It was all so normal that it made my shoulders unclench. I started to think of him as part of the pond, like the cattails and the frogs, a familiar presence. But there were little things too. Things I didn't mention to Cade at first, because I didn't want to sound weird. Like how Graham never ate the fish we caught. He watched us clean them, watched the knife slide under scales, watched the guts drop into the mud, and he never flinched. Sometimes he leaned in closer, like he was listening for something inside the fish, or how he always knew when Cade wasn't there. One week, Cade went up to Marquette to help his cousin fix a roof. I went fishing alone, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with myself. The pond had become my place, and I didn't want to lose it just because Cade was busy. That day, I felt the woods watching me. Not like eyes, not like a person hiding. More like the silence had weight. Like if I turned too fast, I'd bump into it. Graham showed up after about an hour. He greeted me like always. "Rowan," he said warmly. "Just you today?" "Yeah," I said. "Cade's out of town." Graham nodded, and his smile held for a second too long. Then he sat beside me, close enough that his sleeve brushed mine when he moved. He started asking about my family, which wasn't new, but the way he asked felt different, slower, like he was choosing each word from a shelf. I told him the basics, that Marin and I had bounced around, that our aunt took us in, that we were trying to get back on our feet. "And you think you'll stay?" Graham asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Marin talks like we might leave again. She gets restless." Graham went quiet. He stared at the water like it had offended him. Then, without a word, he stood and walked away. No goodbye, no smile, just gone into the trees. It left me unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Like I'd failed a test I didn't know I was taking. The next day, Graham came back. He acted like nothing happened. We made small talk. Then he apologized. "I'm sorry I left abruptly," he said. "You reminded me of someone. Of myself once." He said he'd grown up unstable too. That he'd learned the hard way that family is not always blood. Then he leaned in slightly and said, "The best part of becoming an adult is realizing you get to choose who counts." It sounded nice. It sounded comforting. It sounded like something you'd put on a poster. I thanked him anyway. Graham's eyes held mine. "If you ever needed steadiness," he said, "you could include me in that chosen circle." There was something about the way he said circle that made me picture a shape drawn on the ground. I told him, "Sure, because what else do you say to a man offering kindness?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not fully. A few days later, on a Saturday, I went back out early. The pond was fogged over, and the fog clung low to the surface like it didn't want to leave the water. Every sound felt dampened. Even my footsteps sounded far away. Graham arrived like he always did, right on time. He didn't have cookies that day, no soda, just himself. He sat beside me and watched the line for a while. Then he said, "Have you thought about what I said? About chosen family?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I lied. A bit." Graham's fingers tapped his knee, slow and steady. "Do you like the idea," he asked, "of having someone older looking out for you as a fixed point?" I glanced at him. "I guess it's nice." He smiled slightly, like I'd confirmed something. Then he said, very casually, "People don't understand how hungry a person can get for belonging." The way he said it wasn't dramatic. It was just a fact. Like talking about weather. "I think about it a lot," Graham continued. "Not romance, not friendship. Something older than that. Something that asks more." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Graham leaned closer, and I smelled something faint on him, like damp soil and old paper. "When people truly belong," he said, "they leave marks on each other. Not always visible, but real. A sign that says, I was here. You were mine. We are connected." My throat tightened. He looked at me, and his eyes were bright in a way that made my skin prickle. "Rowan," he said gently, "I'd like to ask you something." I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Okay." He held up his hand, palm facing me. In the center was a small object wrapped in a clean white cloth. He unfolded it. Inside was a fishhook. Not a normal hook. This one was old, dark, and oddly shaped, like it had been bent and rebent by someone with patience. There was a tiny notch filed into it, almost like a letter. Graham said, "This is how my family used to do it." I stared at the hook. "Do what? Choose?" he said. Then, still in that calm voice, he asked, "Can I give you something? Something that won't wash off in the lake. Something that means you don't drift away." I felt my body go rigid. My brain started racing, trying to find the polite exit, trying to make this normal. But it wasn't normal. Graham moved his hand toward my wrist, hook cradled in his cloth like a gift. "No," I said, and my voice came out small. His hand paused. His smile stayed in place, but his eyes changed, like someone had turned a dial. "It won't hurt much," he said. "It's just a..." I stood up so fast, my bucket tipped over. Water and vorm spilled into the mud. I didn't even grab my rod. I just stepped back, heart banging, and said louder, "No." Graham didn't chase me. That's the part that still bothers me. He didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He just watched me with that steady, patient expression, like he'd expected this might happen, and it wasn't the end of anything, just a delay. I backed away, then turned and walked, then jogged, then ran. The woods felt different on the way back, narrower, like the trees had shifted closer together while I wasn't looking. I heard small sounds behind me that could have been squirrels, could have been birds, could have been nothing. When I got home, I came in through the back door and went straight upstairs. Marin saw my face and followed. She asked what happened, and I told her, breathless and shaking, about the hook and the mark, and the way he'd said, "You were mine," without using those exact words. Marin's face went tight and pale. She told Aunt Lisa. Aunt Lisa called a friend she knew in the county office. That friend called someone else. I never spoke to the sheriff directly. I didn't give a statement with a recorder running. Things happened in a sideways, small-town way. Phone calls. Quiet conversations. People saying, "We'll handle it." 2 days later, Aunt Lisa told us, "You won't see that man again." I asked what that meant. She hesitated. "He's leaving," she said. He was encouraged to. Encouraged how? Marin asked. Aunt Lisa looked down at her hands. "Don't worry about it," she said, which is what adults say when they don't want you to know what they did. Cade came back from Marquette the next week. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, jaw clenched, eyes darting like he wanted to look over his shoulder, even in my aunt's kitchen. When I finished, Cade said, "That's messed up. Did you ever notice anything weird?" I asked. He rubbed his forehead. "Not like that. He was just nice." "Yeah," I said. "Nice." Cade and I didn't go back to the big pond for a while. When we finally did, it wasn't relief I felt. It was grief, which made me angry at myself. Not grief for Grom. Grief for the idea of him. For the safe, helpful, cardigan-wearing version that had felt like part of the landscape. The pond looked the same. The cattails stood. The water reflected trees. The frogs complained. But something was different. On the far bank, half hidden in weeds, there was a short post that hadn't been there before. A piece of wood, freshly cut, stuck into the mud. And nailed to it was a little metal tag, like something you'd put on a key. Cade waded closer and squinted. "What's that say?" I didn't want to walk over. I did anyway. The tag had a word stamped into it, clean and deep, like it had been pressed by a machine. Rowan, my name. I felt my stomach drop. My mouth went dry so fast my tongue stuck to my teeth. Cade laughed once, sharp and confused. "Dude, that's not..." Then he stopped. Because behind the post, down in the mud, were more tags. Not all readable, but enough to see the pattern. Names. Lots of them. Some old and rusted, some shiny and new. I reached down with trembling fingers and lifted one. Cade another. Marin. My hands started shaking so hard I dropped them. Cade took a step back. "No," he said, like saying it out loud could make it untrue. "No, that's he couldn't." We stood there in the wet grass, staring at those tags like they were teeth. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, a sick joke, someone messing with us. But then I noticed something else. In the mud near the tags were little punctures, small holes close together, like something sharp had been pressed in and pulled out, like a fishhook. We didn't stay. We left fast, walking the trail in silence, both of us listening for footsteps that never came. When we got back to town, Cade said he'd go talk to someone. The sheriff, his uncle, anyone. That evening, Aunt Lisa came home late. Her face was flushed, like she'd been outside in cold air too long. "What did you do?" Marin asked her. Aunt Lisa stared at us, then at Cade, then at the floor. "I told you," she said quietly. "You won't see him again." I opened my mouth to ask about the tags, but Aunt Lisa spoke first, like she'd heard the question before I said it. "Don't go back," she said. "Not to that pond. Not to any of them." "Why?" I asked, and my voice cracked. Aunt Lisa swallowed. "Because you don't know what you're stepping into." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the names stamped into metal. Kept hearing Grimes' calm voice talking about belonging like it was hunger. At some point, I got up and went to the kitchen for water. The house was dark, except for the little orange clock on the microwave. As I drank, I noticed something on the table. A clean white cloth, folded neatly. I set my glass down slowly. My heart started thumping again, loud enough I could hear it in my ears. I didn't touch the cloth. I didn't want to know what was inside. From the living room, the wind chimes on the porch started moving, soft and steady, even though the air in the house was still. Then, very faintly, like it came from far away through a wall of fog, I heard a sound that reminded me of a line slipping through rod guides. A thin, dry hiss. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at that folded cloth, and something came into my head that I didn't invite. A simple thought, not a voice. Just a fact-shaped fear. Maybe Graham didn't leave. Maybe he just stopped being seen. And maybe, in a town full of ponds and trees and quiet adults who handle things, that was the deal. You keep your mouth shut. You don't go back. And if you ever feel something tug on your wrist when you're alone near the water, you don't look down to see what caught. Because the scary part isn't getting pulled under. It's realizing someone already wrote your name on the tag, and the mud is soft enough to take it. I'm going to tell you this like I'd tell it to a friend sitting across from me late at night, when the house is quiet and nobody's checking the clock anymore. Back in 2012, I wasn't a good person. Not evil, just empty and reckless. I was 22 and living out of my car half the time, popping pills I barely remembered swallowing. Oxy had its hooks in me deep. Days blurred together. Nights stretched on forever. Eventually, the cops caught up with me, and I ended up in a small courtroom that smelled like dust and old coffee. The judge gave me a choice: jail or a state program way out in the countryside called Ridgeway Acres. Ridgeway Acres wasn't rehab in the way people imagine it. No couches. No soft voices. It was a working farm tucked miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by woods so thick they swallowed sound. The deal was simple. Work every day. Follow the rules. Stay clean. Mess up, and you were gone. Most people thought it was punishment dressed up as help. Maybe it was, but for me, It worked. Hard work has a way of quieting the noise in your head. Animals need feeding whether you feel like it or not. Crops don't care if you're having a bad day. When you arrived, they paired you with someone who'd been there longer. They called them guides, but it was more like a buddy system. Someone to watch you. Someone to make sure you didn't wander off into the trees and disappear, which apparently had happened once, though nobody liked to talk about it. After almost a year, they asked me to become a guide. That's when I met Lena. She wasn't my responsibility in an official way. Not like a boss or a caretaker, more like an older sibling arrangement. I was supposed to show her the routine, sleep in the next room, make sure she showed up to work and didn't spiral. That was it. Lena showed up angry, not loud angry, quiet angry, the kind that sits behind the eyes and never blinks. She was smaller than me, sharp-faced, always rubbing at her wrists like something invisible itched there. She hated the farm, hated the animals, hated the rules, but she listened. That's what worried me most. At night, Ridgeway Acres sounded wrong. The animals would go quiet all at once. No crickets, no wind. Just this heavy stillness that pressed against your ears. Lena asked me once if I heard whispering in the fields after dark. I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. About 3 weeks in, things were actually going well. She worked, she slept, she talked more. She even smiled once, though it faded fast, like she caught herself doing something dangerous. Then one afternoon, a truck came down the dirt road. 2 county deputies stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. I knew right away something was wrong. People didn't visit Ridgeway Acres unless they had to. They were looking for Lena. There was an old warrant tied to her name. Another county, something unfinished. They wouldn't say what. The staff panicked. Nobody wanted a scene. I offered to talk to her first. She trusted me. Or at least she pretended to. I found her sitting on her bed, staring at the wall. When I told her, her face went pale, like the blood just drained straight out. She said she didn't remember any warrant. Swore it. Said if she'd done something serious, she'd know. She asked if she could run. I told her no. Told her running only made things worse. Told her the truth, or at least what I thought was the truth. That it was probably something small. Paperwork. A missed court date. I promised I'd walk with her. She nodded. We stepped outside together. Halfway across the yard, she slowed down. I felt it before I saw it. That shift in the air, like when a storm is about to break. She grabbed me from behind. The knife was cold. Pressed so hard into my neck, I could feel my pulse thumping against the blade. The world went strangely quiet, like my ears had filled with water. The deputies shouted. I couldn't really hear the words, just noise. Lena's breath was hot in my ear, shaky, fast. She told me to walk. I did. Every step felt unreal, like I wasn't the one moving my legs, like I was watching it happen to someone else. We moved toward the edge of the fields, where the trees crowded close and the shadows stacked on top of each other. I kept talking, soft, calm, telling her this wouldn't end how she thought, that the woods weren't safe, that people didn't just vanish and start new lives. She laughed, a short, broken sound. She said they wouldn't chase her if they thought they could still save me. That's when I realized she wasn't panicking anymore. She was thinking. She whispered, I'm sorry, like it was already over. I felt warmth on my neck. Then a loud crack split the air. I fell to my knees, convinced I'd been shot. My hands were slick with blood. I didn't know whose. I screamed her name over and over, shaking her shoulders, begging her to wake up. She didn't move. They told me later the bullet hit clean, that she never felt it, that I was lucky. But sometimes, late at night, when everything goes quiet the way it did on that farm, I feel something cold against my throat. I hear breathing just behind my ear, and I can't stop thinking about the way she said sorry. Not like she was apologizing, like she was saying goodbye. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually late at night, usually when people are relaxed enough to listen. Every time, I can tell when the room shifts. People stop smiling. Someone always says, "Wait, what?" That's usually when I know I've gone far enough. So yeah, this happened when I was 17, back in 2011, during my last year at Ridgeway High. I wasn't some star athlete or anything. I just loved basketball. Back then, the game felt like the center of everything. After school, weekends, cold nights, hot gyms. If you weren't playing, you were thinking about playing. I knew I wasn't going anywhere with it. No college scouts. No big dreams. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I played with the same guys every season. We grew up together. Some of them were neighbors. One was my cousin Evan, and another, Marcus, had basically been raised at my house since middle school. We weren't just teammates. We were tied together in that way only small-town kids really understand. That season, somehow, everything clicked. We started winning games we weren't supposed to win. The town got involved. People who'd never watched basketball suddenly cared. By February, we were one game away from a regional title. It felt unreal. Our head coach, Coach Laird, decided we needed one more tune-up before the big game. He scheduled a scrimmage just days before regionals. Looking back, that was reckless. At the time, we were thrilled. We wanted to play. We wanted to prove ourselves. The scrimmage was set up against a mixed team of older players from different schools and rec leagues. Bigger guys. Faster guys. The kind of players who didn't smile much. The game was held at an old gym called Hollow Creek Fieldhouse, on the edge of a part of the city nobody really talked about. The building looked tired. Faded brick. Flickering lights. The parking lot had weeds growing through the cracks. Inside, the gym itself was fine. Clean court. Fresh lines. But there was a problem. Only one locker room. The other team got it. We were sent downstairs. The basement smelled like damp concrete and rust. Winter had settled in hard that year, and the cold down there felt heavier, like it clung to your skin. The lights buzzed faintly, and even fully on, they didn't reach the corners. The ceiling was low enough that taller guys had to duck. I remember stopping halfway down the steps and thinking, I don't like this place. I joked about it at first, said it felt like the start of a bad movie. Evan laughed. Marcus told me to relax. I kept glancing toward the darker parts of the room, where broken chairs and boxes were stacked against the walls. Someone used their phone light to check around, but it barely cut through the gloom. Everything back there looked wrong somehow. Too quiet. Too still. Eventually, Coach Laird came down and got us focused. Once the game started, I forgot about the basement entirely. We lost the scrimmage. Not badly, but enough to bruise our confidence. Afterward, we went back downstairs to change and talk it over. The coaches gave their notes and headed upstairs. Guys filtered out one by one. Soon, it was just me and Marcus. We were tying our shoes when something slammed against metal in the far end of the room. Not a small noise. A full, sharp crash that echoed. We both froze. The air felt tighter, like it had thickened. My heart started pounding, and I hated how fast it did that. Marcus whispered my name and asked if I heard it too. I nodded. We stood there for a few seconds, listening. Nothing. Against my better judgment, we walked toward the sound. Marcus lifted his phone and aimed the weak light toward the corner. That's when we saw him. He was standing between the stacks of junk, completely still, like he'd been waiting. He looked older than us, maybe late 30s. His clothes were filthy. His eyes reflected the light in a way that didn't feel human. No one spoke. Then his mouth opened. The sound that came out wasn't a scream exactly. It was lower, rougher, like something pulled from deep inside his chest. The noise crawled over my skin. We ran. The footsteps behind us were fast and uneven. Too fast. I felt fingers wrap around my wrist and yank me down hard. My shoulder hit concrete. The man stumbled too, and for a second we were tangled together. I don't remember standing up. I just remember running. We burst into the parking lot yelling. Evan and the others rushed toward us. Marcus tried to explain. Words spilled out of him like they were tripping over each other. Coach Laird and Coach Henley ran inside before anyone could stop them. The police arrived minutes later. Sirens bounced off the building. Officers rushed in. The waiting felt endless. When the coaches came back out, Coach Laird was bleeding. His arm was wrapped in a towel that was already soaked through. The police dragged the man out in cuffs. He wasn't fighting. He was smiling. That smile stayed with me. Years passed. I ran into Coach Henley at a grocery store once. He looked older, tired. We talked about that night. He told me the man had hidden behind the stairwell. Said he had a blade. Said things happened too fast. What he didn't explain is the last thing he said before we parted. He leaned closer and said, "We never found out how long he'd been down there." I asked what he meant. Coach Henley just shook his head. The building logs didn't match. The locks hadn't been broken. Someone had been feeding him. I still think about that basement sometimes. About the boxes, the quiet, the way the man stood there like he knew us. Last year, I drove past where Hollow Creek Fieldhouse used to be. The building was gone. Just an empty lot. But for a second, I swear I smelled damp concrete. And for a second longer than that, I had the strange, sinking feeling that someone was still down there, waiting for the lights to turn back on. I used to teach at a small university, back when I was younger, and still thought I understood people. This was a long time ago, sometime in the early 2000s, before smartphones ruled everything, and before campuses felt like little cities of their own. I taught literature back then, nothing fancy, mostly night classes. I liked those better. Fewer people, softer voices, more space between words. Over the years, I taught hundreds of students. Most of them blur together now. You remember patterns more than faces. A laugh here, a habit of tapping a pen there. But every once in a while, someone sticks in your head like a splinter. You don't want to think about them, but you do anyway. There was one student like that. I'll call him Aaron, though that wasn't his name. He transferred in from overseas halfway through the year, quiet at first. Polite in the way someone is polite when they don't really mean it. He sat too still, like he was always listening for something no one else could hear. The first real conversation we had was strange. He looked at the name on my office door and laughed, just a short sound, like air escaping. Then he said, very casually, that where he came from, women didn't stand at the front of rooms like that, didn't tell people what to do, didn't give grades. I remember smiling, because that's what you do when you're trying to keep things calm. I told him things worked a little differently here. He nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was more like he was memorizing something. After that, he changed, or maybe he stopped pretending. He argued over grades that hadn't even been given yet. He stared too long. When he spoke in class, it wasn't to add anything. It was like he was testing how much space he could take up before someone pushed back. When it became clear he wasn't going to coast through the course, something in him snapped. His assignments stopped making sense. Paragraphs trailed off. Pages were half empty, like he'd lost interest halfway through a thought. Sometimes he'd hand in work that smelled faintly of smoke, like burned paper. Then he stopped showing up. At first, I was relieved. The room felt lighter without him. Conversations flowed better. But weeks passed, and his name stayed on the roster. No emails, no excuses, just absence. I mentioned it to my friend Lena one afternoon while we were grading papers in the staff lounge. She froze mid-sip. Her eyes went unfocused, like she was looking through me. "You don't know?" she asked. That's when things shifted. A young woman named May had gone missing. She wasn't in my class. She lived off campus with 2 friends and worked weekends at a cafe near the river. She'd gone out one evening with someone she'd met through classes. Drinks, conversation, nothing traumatic. She didn't come home. At first, no one panicked. College life is messy. People crash on couches. Phones die. But by the second night, her friends couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Her shoes were still by the door. When the police asked who she'd been with, they were given Aaron's name. He told them she'd left early, sighed she got a call, and walked out without saying goodbye. He sounded annoyed about it, like her disappearance was an inconvenience. They would have left it there too, but her phone kept pinging in the same place. Close, too close. They went back. I wasn't there, obviously. I only know what came out later, and even then, pieces were missing. But they found her alive, barely. She was hidden away in a room that didn't look like it was meant for living. No windows, just a mattress on the floor. The air smelled burnt, sour Rome. She couldn't speak when they found her, not at first. She just kept flinching whenever someone moved too fast. Her wrists were raw. Her eyes wouldn't focus on faces. What she eventually said didn't all make sense. She talked about being taught lessons, about being told to stay still, about fire being brought close to her skin so she'd remember where she belonged. She said he kept saying the same thing over and over, like a rule he'd memorized long ago. I never heard his side again. The university issued a short statement, something about cooperation and concern. Aaron was gone before the semester ended, sent away quietly. No trial anyone could attend. No sentence that matched what had been done. Years passed. I left teaching not long after. Told people I was burned out. That part was true, I guess. I still think about May sometimes. I wonder if she hears certain sounds and feels like she's back in that room. I hope she's okay, wherever she is. Every now and then, though, something strange happens. I'll be walking home late, and I'll catch the smell of smoke where there shouldn't be any. Or I'll hear footsteps behind me that stop when I stop. Once, I found an old essay tucked into a book I hadn't opened in years. Half written. The last line cut off mid-sentence. It wasn't in my handwriting. I tell myself it doesn't mean anything. People tell stories like this all the time. Memory plays tricks. Guilt fills in blanks. But sometimes, late at night, I think about how easily he disappeared, how cleanly. And I wonder if he really left it all, or if he just learned how to stay unseen.